Apparently in September 2024, the DoD updated the directive to expand on what kind of situations and circumstances would allow U.S. military to use lethal force and control Americans. Obviously, people are very concerned about unrest around the election. And I just wrote a book about that. It's good that we can talk about it tonight. And it's not just American citizens who are concerned about unrest around the election. It's also the government which is concerned about unrest around the election, because everybody can see it coming. Without a doubt, it is probably the most contentious. America is probably the most divided that we've seen it in years. Not ever. If you go back and read our history, there have been times when America was quite a bit more divided than we are now, and there was a lot more unrest than there is now. So unrest is part and parcel with the transfer of power. Those people who have the power don't want to give it up, and those people that are getting the power going to do what they can to keep it. So especially after what we saw after the last presidential election, the left is terrified of right-wing political violence. Now, the crazy thing about that is it's actually the right that should be terrified about political violence, if just based on recent history. Because if you go back and look at the amount of politically motivated violence that has taken place in America over the last 8 years, you will find between 150 and 200 incidents of left-wing motivated political violence. The FBI still doesn't consider the Black Lives Matter protests to be politically motivated violence, and it caused over $2.1 billion in damage, and 25 people died. And the FBI still says, what political violence? We don't see any political violence here. But yet, they still say that Charlottesville was politically motivated violence when there was one guy who drove into a crowd of people and ran somebody over and killed somebody, when the only violence that took place was left-wing violence against the protesters. There were people who were protesting, and I'm not making excuses for those people, but they were protesting peaceably. If you go back and look at the footage, they were marching with signs and torches and things like that, and they were attacked by left-wing counter-protesters. So the violence started against the right, not because of it. But the FBI still calls that right-wing politically motivated violence. So if you go back and try to count them up, it's hard, because most of the websites that you see that count that stuff, like the FBI, will work very hard to skew the data. They will lump in, for example, the Sandy Hook mass violence attack, or the one that was down in Florida on Valentine's Day, and call that politically motivated violence. Suffice it to say, 99% of all of the politically motivated riots that we have seen over the last 8 years have come from the left. And so people understand that on a visceral level. You understand that on a visceral level. Even if the media is telling you otherwise, you get it. And so because of that, when you see these things coming out that the government is preparing, you're seeing it on X and you're seeing it on the media, that this directive was issued and it gives the U.S. military the ability to use lethal force against American citizens, you're going to sit up and take notice of that. You're going to go like, hey, wait a minute, that's not cool. The problem is you're being bombarded from two directions. I want to talk about that a little more in a minute. But first of all, let's go through this particular rumor and talk about it. This directive is from the Department of Defense, 5240.01, which documents procedures when there's a potential use of lethal force. Now, when I actually went through the document, what I found is that it doesn't actually give the government any powers that it didn't have already. It clarifies a few things, but it does not expand U.S. military powers to control or use lethal force against Americans. What it does is outline the Department of Defense policy on intelligence gathering activities and the assistance that these intelligence components, like the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, can provide to law enforcement agencies and other like civil authorities, right? So they're talking about, can the DIA or the NSA provide certain assistance to your local police force or to a federal police force, something that's inside the United States. And there is a clause in there that talks about the use of lethal force, which I'll get to in a minute. But first of all, I want to point out that this document stipulates that the DoD can only provide assistance to law enforcement in very specific cases, and particularly cases in which lives are in danger. So it would be like if there was a terror threat, an imminent threat of a terror attack somewhere in the United States, like maybe the Boston Marathon bombing, the DIA, the Defense Department, could potentially provide intelligence to local law enforcement to help them get ahead of that attack. So it's specialized to sharing intelligence, technical support, or certain equipment. Okay, now, when it comes to lethal force, this particular document, 5210.01, what it did is they changed the language slightly. They just clarified it. And it says it's explicitly limited to use lethal force in the United States against American citizens. Any support involving legal force requires the approval of the Secretary of Defense and might also require presidential authorization. Now, that applies when it's reasonably foreseen that the support might result in lethal outcomes, such as in civil disturbances or certain emergency responses. And that's section 3.3 of that document. And that's the part that was clarified, such as in civil disturbances and certain emergency responses. Now, if you were somebody who didn't trust the government a whole lot, and you saw that they just added something in that said civil disturbances or certain emergency responses, and you thought about January 6th, or you thought about what just happened in Hurricanes Milton and Helene in Tennessee and North Carolina and places like that, you might get all excited and go, oh, wait a minute, they just added civil disturbances and certain emergency responses to things that might be used for lethal force. But if you read it carefully, what it's actually doing is it's adding those things in specific to things that would require the specific written approval of the Secretary of Defense and or the President of the United States. Whereas before, those were maybe left up to the commander on the ground. They were maybe left up to some subordinate commander. Now what they've done is they have specified that if it's a civil disturbance or emergency response, like to a hurricane, if any of the support that these intelligence units of the Defense Department We're not talking about US soldiers necessarily. We're not talking about infantry troops. We're talking specifically about spooks that work for the Defense Intelligence Agency or ancillary agencies like that. Intel guys. But if any of their support might possibly cause a situation that would result in lethal outcomes, then it must be authorized by the President or the Secretary of Defense in writing for every case. How do we know that's what it's talking about? It says that pretty specifically there. That's, again, section 3.3 of that, if you want to go look it up. But it also goes on to specifically uphold the Posse Comitatus Act, which is 18 U.S. Code section 1385, which generally prohibits the use of any federal military force to perform domestic law enforcement activities in the United States, unless it is explicitly authorized by Congress or by the Constitution, like in the case of an invasion. While I can see where people who are already on a hair trigger in their distrust of the US government might say, whoa, hang on, they just changed this and reissued it. This is a document that's been out there for a long time. And they periodically update the document. The last time it was updated before this week was 2017, I think. And it was due for an update. And so they go through and they just have their lawyers check through this document and make sure that it's still relevant. And they might make a few small changes like that. I can virtually guarantee that whoever made that change was specifically thinking about January 6th and the Hurricane Helene response, or maybe they were thinking about like other hurricane responses or whatever, but it just is freaking people out that this came out right before the election. It was probably a scheduled update anyway. So they probably had been working on this for a year and it just happened to come out. Now, let's just put it this way. What initially made me skeptical when I saw this coming out on Twitter and saw it being spread around was who was spreading it. Because if it's coming out on InfoWars or if it's coming out on some of those kinds of shows, then you should immediately be skeptical. Not because everything they put out is untrue or wrong. As a matter of fact, a lot of the things that they put out in 2020 ended up being correct, but because they definitely have a strong agenda. And to be fair, I'm equally skeptical when I see something reported by CNN or MSNBC. Okay, these are two sides of the spectrum. Okay, Tim Miller is watching. He's contacting me and telling me I'm wrong about the DIA. So maybe I'm using the DIA as an example here, and I shouldn't be, because I trust Tim. Tim definitely knows a thing or two about the federal government. So when it's talking about intel agencies of the Department of Defense, I was making an assumption we were talking about organizations like the DIA. Okay, so actually, Tim is saying we should be alarmed about this. So what I'll do is I'll get Tim on a live. We'll do a live together and we'll talk about this. But so I'm gonna go on with what the studying that I did here. And then we'll let Tim come on and tell me why I'm wrong. And I certainly could be wrong. I'm sitting here telling you that I don't trust the government and that the government certainly is making preparations for the potential unrest that we will see after this election. Without a doubt, the government is expecting violence. Let's talk about what you can do. I want to talk about what you can do to keep your family safe in the America that we're going to see coming very soon. It's already here, but it's going to get worse. Now, depending on who the president is, depending on who the Secretary of Defense is, that could be broadly enough defined that it could be used against normal citizens. So how can we keep our families safe in the case of general or localized violence surrounding these elections and going forward? Because depending on who gets elected, I'm telling you right now, if the left loses this election, they will do everything they can to tear this country apart. We saw them do it the last time, and it'll be worse this time. So if you're worried about the war in Ukraine or the war in Israel, and you're living in the United States, I think you need to be a little more worried and preparing for the war that's coming in the United States. So let's talk about this. I want to go through these things because this is stuff, the book that I just released called The Death of Civilization is really a book to help you get prepared for the death of civilization. And it's how to prepare your family. Now, because there are so many people out there, state actors, that are trying to divide us, the very first thing I'll say is that the gist of my book is that we should start doing more to unify with our neighbors and the people that we live near, the people in your neighborhood, the people in your church. This is what the book is really about. And so if you want to get those books, I'm not going to send you a physical book. I just want to make that clear. You are not going to get a hardcover in the mail. People have been sending me their addresses. It is a download. It's a PDF file, or I can actually send you an EPUB file if you know how to put that into Kindle, if you want to read it on your Kindle. Go to chuckholton.com, become a supporter, and you can download those books as a paying supporter. There's a lot more you can get as a supporter as well. That's supporter-only content. And I'm doing everything I can. We had a meeting today with our business manager to brainstorm on a bunch of other stuff that we can put on there to make it worthwhile for you to continue being a supporter, because you're going to get a lot of really good extra content and you're going to love it, okay? So we're trying to make it very valuable for you to do that, okay? So go to chuckholton.com, please, and sign up as a supporter over there. You'll have my gratitude. All right, God bless you. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.